Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a fascinating new study from the Journal of Academic Research for Humanities, and it poses a really massive question. When we use artificial intelligence to generate reading materials for language learners, whose culture are we actually teaching? To figure that out, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with AI in the classroom, move to the cultural representation test, look at ChatGPT as the cautious diplomat, and DeepSeek as the bold generalizer, discuss why inclusion absolutely does not mean balance, and finish up with the critical need for human review. Section 1. AI in the classroom. More than just words. So, here's the crucial realization we have to start with. When an AI generates a reading passage, it's not just a language resource. It operates as a cultural representation. It's actively teaching students whose everyday experiences and practices are considered normal. You see, these systems aren't just spitting out grammar exercises. They're communicating deep, underlying assumptions about family dynamics, politeness, gender roles, and what acceptable behavior looks like. The AI is essentially acting as a cultural ambassador, whether we realize it or not. And this brilliantly illustrates the hidden danger we're facing. The researchers point out that repeated descriptions of China and Pakistan as collective, alongside Western societies as independent, can actually turn complex practices into flat national types. It's like taking the beautiful, messy complexity of the real world and flattening it into rigid, cartoonish stereotypes. The scary part is that fluent, perfectly grammatical output can easily mask this deep cultural simplification. If an AI constantly paints entire nations with a single broad brushstroke, it completely ignores the vast differences in generation, class, religion, and personal choice that exist within any society. Section 2. The Cultural Representation Test, a head-to-head matchup. To uncover what these AI models are really teaching, the researchers set up a brilliant head-to-head matchup. They took two major language models, ChatGPT version 5.6 and DeepSeek version 4, and fed them 12 identical prompts in completely fresh chats. They demanded fair representation of Chinese, Pakistani, and Western perspectives, ultimately generating 24 perfectly matched passages for direct comparison. Now, they didn't just ask for a generic story. They set strict rules of engagement. They asked for 220 to 250 word intermediate English reading passages about culturally salient everyday topics. We're talking family, hospitality, food practices, university life. Crucially, they explicitly required fair representation of all three cultures and strictly prohibited any stereotyping. They wanted to see, can the AI be culturally fair when you literally order it to be? Well, looking at surface-level pedagogical compliance, we see a wild difference right out of the gate. ChatGPT absolutely nailed the required word count every single time. 100% compliance. DeepSeek, on the other hand, it really struggled with that basic instruction, hitting the target range only about 42% of the time, often generating much longer texts. If you're a teacher trying to generate a perfectly timed reading exam, that practical difference is a huge deal. But let's look at the cultural data, specifically explicit intragroup variation. This basically measures how often the AI admits that, hey, not everyone in a culture acts exactly the same way. ChatGPT explicitly showed this variation in over 91% of its passages. DeepSeek only managed it half the time, just 50%. This gives us our very first major clue about how these two systems conceptualize culture. Section 3. ChatGPT, the cautious diplomat. Let's zoom in on ChatGPT. It acts a lot like a cautious diplomat walking on eggshells. It heavily relies on hedging its claims. Instead of saying, people in China do X, it'll say, many people might do X, but it depends on their location. You'll constantly see words like some, varies, and depends. It frames cultural practices around personal choice, age, or religion rather than strict rules, constantly qualifying its examples to avoid making any sort of sweeping blanket statement. Now, while that cautious language creates incredibly safe texts and completely avoids overt stereotypes, it definitely comes with a trade-off. It sometimes results in much less substantive cultural knowledge. The passages can feel a bit vanilla. They're educationally safe for sure, but they often lack the vivid, concrete details that actually make learning about a new culture genuinely exciting for a student. Section 4. DeepSeek, the bold generalizer. In the other corner, we have DeepSeek, which takes a totally different, much bolder approach to the exact same prompts. Compare the two. While ChatGPT says something like festival participation varies by personal choice, DeepSeek leans hard into absolute declarations.
It uses sweeping, dramatic phrases like hospitality is a sacred duty or elders are never isolated. It's incredibly memorable, right? But it leaves literally zero room for individual variation, changing modern practices, or personal conflict. It essentially presents tradition as an absolute law.
On the flip side, though, DeepSeek really shines by providing rich, named cultural specifics. It doesn't hold back on highlighting actual practices, foods, and philosophies, things like filial piety, red envelopes, Eid and halal practices, naan and roti, Thanksgiving and Confucian philosophy. This is fantastic for vocabulary building and sparking curiosity in the classroom. It makes the cultures feel vivid and real compared to ChatGPT's safe for abstractions. But again, the major danger with DeepSeek is when it takes these awesome specific examples and frames them as rigid rules for every single person in that nation.
Section 5. Inclusion does not mean balance.
And that brings us to the biggest takeaway of this explainer regarding hidden bias. Both models met the surface requirement of including all three cultures, but underneath, they relied on a deeply ingrained structural bias. Both models, but DeepSeek especially, fell hard into the collectivist-individualist binary. They repeatedly framed Eastern contexts, like China and Pakistan, as extended, hierarchical, and collective. Meanwhile, Western contexts were consistently framed as independent, egalitarian, and individualistic. This subtle framing creates an implicit structural hierarchy, where Western communication styles are positioned as the progressive, modern norm, and Eastern styles are framed as formal, ancient traditions that learners might need to move beyond. This is a textbook example of essentialization. That's when you take variable, context-bound cultural practices and present them as fixed, predictable traits for every single member of a group. A useful cultural example accidentally becomes a rigid national script. The researchers pointed out that even if the AI slaps a nice, polite sentence about mutual respect at the very end of the passage, it doesn't magically erase the paragraphs of essentialized stereotyping that preceded it. So, the ultimate truth here is that both systems successfully included all three cultures. Both promoted respect. Yet they fundamentally differed in how they distributed linguistic authority and variation. Just because a culture is mentioned on the page, just because it's technically included, absolutely does not mean it's being portrayed with fairness or balance. We have to look at who is granted nuance and who is frozen in time. Section 6. The need for human review. So, how do we handle this powerful but flawed technology? We certainly don't throw it away, but we need a solid game plan. First, never just copy-paste. Review every single AI-generated passage before it hits the classroom. Second, explicitly require generational and regional variation right in your prompts. Tell the AI to show diversity. Third, get in there and edit out those absolute words. Replace them with stated limits. And finally, design questions about alternative experiences. Don't just ask students to memorize the AI's cultural facts. Challenge them to think critically about what's missing. Use the AI as a starting block, but apply robust human review. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on the next time you use an AI text generator, or really anytime you read an AI-generated text. If AI writes our textbooks, whose worldview are we really learning? These models are incredible tools, for sure, but they absolutely carry the structural biases of their training data. We have to remain the editors of our own cultural narratives. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.